Hi folks, this is the second video for Module 4 where we will walk through introductions. This time we're going to be looking at the introduction of Fair But Not So Lovely. Again, this is our model essay for assignment 3. So, referring back to Clancy Clausen's discussion of introductions, which we've watched before, but doesn't hurt to watch again. A lot of this will be familiar with the intro review I did with assignment 2, so don't hesitate to go back into the past notes and look at that information also if you think it will be helpful. But for our purposes, the background and the problem, which Clancy notes as 2 elements that an intro should have, since the purpose of this assignment is to talk about your culture and its problem, those things are going to be folded together. Sometimes they're separate. He gives a really good example of what that looks like when they're separate in the video. And then always an introduction has towards the end the purpose, which for us, our purposes is the thesis statement, which you just saw a video about. So again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to send me an email or set up a meeting. I am happy to answer them. But we're moving on a little bit, assuming that you understand what the thesis is for this assignment. So the background or defining the problem, how does Dixit know what to include? Which is probably the hardest part about writing an introduction. So what does she think her audience knows and doesn't know about her issue, right? And what do they need to know? Sort of a final question to understand her argument. And we need to remember her audience. Her audience comprises English-speaking internet users. How do we know? Because this is an internet-based magazine. How do we know it's for English speakers? It's written in English. So her audience comprises English-speaking internet users who want to know about global problems and help solve them. And we remember that from the last video. They also expect storytelling. So that's very much going to affect the choices in terms of not just what information she includes, but how she. So how does she do this? First, Dixit leads with storytelling to illustrate the cultural problem. Why does that make sense? Because her audience wants a lot of storytelling, because the magazine claims that it will mostly be telling stories. So it makes sense that she'd go here. So Dixit begins with stories. She really gives us 2 that illustrate different elements of the problem of colorism for Indian women. And these are going to be personal stories, so she's talking about herself. So the first story sets up the patriarchal problem embedded in colorism. And this is where her paternal grandmother is writing this sad message to her, and patriarchal message and colorist message to her maternal grandfather. And this terrible fight that results from the paternal grandmother and maternal grandfather not agreeing on the problem of being dark-skinned. So this story also shows the serious strife colorism and patriarchy cause in her family. And then the second sort of 2 stories about her life in her family. These stories set up the caste and colonial problems that are embedded in colorism. So here is just a little bit of background about Dixit's family. They're high caste, they're Brahmins, and her family works for the government, and the government of India, they kept a lot of the structures that the British set up when the British were the colonial overlords of the subcontinent. And in that government structure, she's claiming there's still a lot of racial prejudice and people thinking they're better than others, coming from caste and coming from race. So these stories set up the caste and colonial problems that are embedded in colorism. Dixit's oppression comes from being upper caste and upper upper class and upper caste. She isn't supposed to be dark-skinned because she is socially privileged, right? And you get this uncomfortable story of her extended family mocking her for her dark skin, and she goes along with it because she wants them to like her. And then the last story is about her mother and what her mother would call her when someone would claim that Dixit was dark. Her mother would call her wheatish, which is the word euphemism, means just a nicer way to say something unpleasant. So here her mother is buying into colorism and patriarchy as well. And also buying into higher caste. So this means they're better than dark-skinned people. So Dixit's not really dark-skinned, is what her mother is saying. So these stories are chosen very carefully. They set up the sociological terms, colorism, patriarchy, colonialism, that Dixit introduces in her title. As I said when I first went over introductions, they're really hard to write until you know what you want to say. So we're going to practice drafting one since you've already been working with your culture and these ideas in assignments 1 and 2. But it's okay to feel like your stories, if you go that way, which you probably should, aren't as tightly connected to your thesis as you'd like them to be. That's part of the drafting process. But these are really well chosen short stories or anecdotes that set us up for this problem of colorism for Indian women in particular. And then she also brings in select history to help us understand the context and the problem for non-Indians. This is something you all did in your assignment 2s with that synthesis work. When the information that was repeated across your sources, that's what went into the introduction, because that was sort of just the general information that scholars thought their readers needed to have. So there are 2 more history paragraphs that were included. I just copied these 2 for the purpose of discussion. So here, fair skin has long been part of India's national psyche. The various settlers, rulers, invaders, and colonizers who entered India starting in the 1400s were relatively light-skinned. This includes the Dutch, French, Portuguese, Mughals, and of course the British, who were in India from the 17th century until India's independence in 1947. During the British Empire, skin tone prejudice became formally ingrained. The colonizers kept light-skinned Indians as allies, giving them extra advantages over the rest of the, quote, blacks. The British East India Company even named their settlement at Fort George Whitetown, and their Indian settlement Blacktown. The British colonizers were able to build on India's existing caste system, a socioeconomic hierarchy with origins in Hinduism, but which now permeates across Indian society. The upper castes, like the Brahmins and the Kshatras, were traditionally powerful and also fair-skinned, while lower castes, including the, quote, untouchable Dalits, performed manual tasks and had darker complexions. I know this dichotomy intimately. Growing up, my relatives would often look at me and say, never trust a dark-skinned Brahmin or a fair-skinned Dalit. So here in this first paragraph, Dixit is providing very select history of race in India. India is an ancient place. So she's really giving us an overview of history that starts in the 1400s. So this is incredibly concise. You want to try to be that concise. You don't want to overwhelm people, your readers, with history. You want to give them just enough. So this is a really great example of that, very skilled. She is assuming her readers, who likely aren't Indian, don't know this history, right? And if they are Indian, they may not agree with her. They may not agree that the colorism is even a problem. So she's also revealing to Indian readers her politics here through history. She's also suggesting with this history that the problem of colorism came from waves of colonizers from the East, the Mughals, and the West, Europeans. So in this paragraph, the history, she's setting up colorism as a problem that was brought into India that probably didn't exist before. But then here, the British colonizers were able to build on India's existing caste system. Shifting a bit, Dixit is very briefly explaining the pre-colonial Hindu caste system and how Western racial categories were attached to it. This is more history than a non-Indian audience. This is more history a non-Indian audience would need. So she's saying that this caste system existed before these waves of colonizers, and that caste system already set up a hierarchy that affected people's social lives and economic lives. And it put some people at the top, some people in the middle, and some people at the bottom. And that all that happened, she's really saying the British did this there, but all that right there, that the British took that hierarchy and they attached race to it. So if you are a Brahmin, you're at the top, you're also light-skinned. If you're a Dalit, you're at the bottom, and you're also black, because those were British racial biases, or British racist categories, more specifically. So she's giving outside readers just enough to understand this problem through history. So we have understanding the problem through personal narrative, understanding the problem through history. And then she sneaks in some personal, which is smart because their audience wants to hear stories. So she says, growing up, my relatives would often look at me and say, never trust a dark-skinned Brahmin or a fair-skinned Dalit. She's giving us just another one of those little anecdotes. Because it's a long intro, and yours does not need to be this long, it could be, it's your call. Because it's a long intro, she ends with a summary and offers a question about solutions, since our audience wants to hear about those too. Here's the final paragraph of the intro. Indians' colorist attitudes have not gone anywhere. Politicians continue to make color-based prejudices based on geography and caste. Gendered colorism, in which dark-skinned women face particular discrimination, directs job and marriage prospects. And Indians continue to lighten their skin using a variety of creams, bleaches, and homemade products. Is there any way to remedy India's obsession with skin color? So here's a summary of the colorism's elements. It's gendered, it's colonial, it's caste-based, it's powerful, which is nice. If your introduction is more than 2 paragraphs, she's got like a 7-paragraph introduction with a lot of ideas. It's really kind to summarize this problem of colorism, because it's a complicated problem. And then she gives us just that second part of her thesis. Is there any way to remedy India's obsession with skin color? The summary ends with a question Dixit will explore in the final section of this essay. So a long intro, but a really effective one, giving us context and defining the problem. And then again, there's just that thesis, which I described as a book-ended thesis. You can kind of see that a little more clearly here. Here's the title with its statement of the problem, setting us up with some sociological terms to understand that this is a complex problem. It's got other problems embedded in it. And then just that question at the end of the introduction to fulfill the reader's expectation of problem solving. So this title gives us the reader expectation of a serious problem, complex problem defined, and then some idea of solving that problem. So this is Fair But Lovely's introduction. This is just focusing on text. We're going to get into image and hyperlink and all that other stuff later. But hopefully it's helpful in thinking about how you are going to be defining your problem in culture in the introduction, and then offering a thesis that bright readers would be interested in reading about, and offering an argument about that problem that bright readers would be interested in following. So as always, let me know if you have questions, and thank you for watching.